Hey everyone, this is Miss Saunders here, and I'm here to kind of expound and further explain some ideas that were introduced in the two readings for this week, which were excerpts from Writing for Business as well as Better Business Writing. We're going to start with some ideas that were introduced in Better Business Writing. This is including regarding the use of tone, which is something that we've talked about quite a bit already. But I think that this book gives a few or three good examples of how to use tone in business correspondence effectively. And they have three types of letters. One is written in a friendly tone, one is an urgent tone, and one is in a firm tone. And I think the important thing to kind of retain from these three different examples is that they all maintain a certain amount of civility and goodwill, which is what we've talked about in week 2 and week 1. So I thought that there was a good example of civility in the firm letter with the sentence, "We hope to remain on friendly terms during and after the move." So the bottom line is that in business communication, regardless of whether or not you're sending an email that the person that you're corresponding with necessarily wants to hear, it's important to maintain a degree of civility. And I think the excerpts in the reading this week show us how to do that while still expressing yourself. Um, so another kind of tenet that they bring up is plainly state the issue you're addressing. And while you do so, you want to keep your goal in mind and you don't want to undermine your efforts with an inappropriate tone. And you also want to state plainly and simply what you hope to achieve on the issue that you're regarding. So there can be no miscommunications about the intent and the message of what you're expressing. So, so now we're going to move on to, um, oh, I'm sorry. So we're going to talk about pointers for considering your audience. So, one, get to the point quickly. Time is of the essence in professional writing. Everyone is on the clock, and you really want to say what you need to say as quickly as possible. Prove quickly that you have something valuable to say. Again, it's good to do that early in the text to kind of prove your worth in a sense. Highlight the things your readers care about most. This entails you considering your audience before you put a single word on the page, right? Consider the things that they care about and what they hope to see, and try to highlight those. And that's really one quality of really effective professional writing. When I think about my graduate school applications and different letters that I would write for different graduate schools, I was definitely thinking about preparing materials that were specific to whom I was addressing. So, of course, you have some paragraphs that you use for everyone, but you also wanted to have paragraphs in your letters. This is like your statement of purpose, your cover letter, that were specifically geared towards the school and the faculty of the school you were addressing. And that's really I think what makes a difference if you look at people who get into graduate school successfully and people who don't. So definitely being aware of your readers and showing them what they want to see is very important. Envisioning your readers and using a tone appropriate for them is another important tenet of successful business writing. All right, next we're going to go on to a common language policy. Now, this was mentioned in Writing for Business, kind of the older texts we're reading in this class. So the author of this actual common language policy was the vice president of Ford Motor Company, and he advised, number one, the clarity and organization of your own thoughts. So, and I think kind of he was talking about, good organization, coherent organization, one that has a beginning, middle, and end. Number two, kind of having an understanding of your audience and kind of writing towards them, right? Keeping them in mind as you write. And three, plain hard work. I think there's a myth um, in the world, I guess that's one way to say it, that people who um, are inherently good at either math or English, and you're either born a gifted writer or you will never be good at writing at all. And I can tell you that's just simply not true. And you really need to work hard, no matter your level of skill set, if you want to produce something that's worthwhile. And it's hard work for everyone. So I really can't underestimate that fact. All right, so in writing for business, I thought that the way that this chapter was working had a really interesting way of thinking about how you might choose your words and how you might think about them in terms of your intended, about them, I mean, by them, I mean your words, in terms of thinking, keeping your intended audience in mind whilst you craft, the language that you use. So she talks about one distinction that she makes is whether or not you want to use concrete or abstract words. She talked about how concrete words create a visual picture in the reader's mind, whereas the abstract are non-actual, so they are best used for conceptual, all-inclusive possibilities. Because of course, there are times in communication when rapid, inescapable sense are not ideal for your purpose in writing. So, the author of this excerpt of this chapter in Writing for Business is really asking you to think about language in a very, very highly specific way. And really, that's the way that brings, I think, the most success with language, is looking at it, thinking about being as detailed as possible as you make all these little decisions. So she talks about that, she gives an example of the difference between concrete and abstract writing. And so it's two possible thesis titles for a hypothetical paper that none of us have read. So title one is Why the Foreman Hates the Boss. Title two is The Emotional Coefficient Correlatives in Interpersonal Relationships Between Management and Supervisory Echelons. So we see how the second option is the use of abstract language. And we see how it slows up the reader's, slows our uptake. Again, it's a little bit more nebulous. There's more space to kind of insert ourselves in there, as opposed to Why the Foreman Hates the Boss is a very, direct, that when he talks about direct, inescapable sense, that's a great example. There's not much left to the reader's imagination, or yeah, there's not much left to the reader's imagination. It's very clearly stated. So you might want to think about times in which it would be appropriate to be more vague, or to kind of rely on abstract words. And again, you have to think about your intended audience and, of course, the situation in which you're writing, and you want to think about what effect is desired. But largely, most of the time, you want to be using concrete words in professional writing, because it's important to communicate firmly, right? Communicate accurately. And you see with abstract, it becomes a little bit more difficult to retain that sense of accuracy. All right, so choosing your words. She talks about the choice of whether or not you want to use short or long words. Talks about how in the book she has a quote that says, "The need is father to the word," which I think is very important, and it kind of hammers in what we've been talking about for the last few weeks, which is that you want to think about what you need when you think about what words you choose. And it's kind of an open model. It's kind of like, I don't know if any of you guys know too much about virtue ethics, but Aristotle basic fundamental tenet of that was like, choose your ethical things, your ethical concerns based on your particular situation. Like, there's no one rule for every situation. What's right and what's wrong really depends on the particulars. And I think that relates to kind of this vague plan of, you need to think about what you need to use at the right appropriate time depending on your particular situation. So she notes in the chapter that long, wide open words do serve the purpose of ambiguity, if that is the writer's intent and need. However, it should be noticed that ambiguity is not good for business oftentimes. So kind of the similar conversation that we're having around the concrete versus abstract. I think, if you want to use a lot of like long words are usually, well, short words I feel like are used more often, whereas long words you might be like going into like a little bit of a higher level vocabulary and diction. And when you're writing for business, depending on who you're writing to, but a lot of the time you want to be using language that everyone understands, because maybe you're not too familiar with who you're corresponding with, or who's going to be reading your text. So you definitely want to always ensure clarity and readability of everything that you write. So we see again another example in this text of from Winston Churchill. So we see this is kind of a famous portion of a speech during World War II. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and on the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. So here we see a lot of one syllable name words. We see that it's kind of like a punchy rhythm. And we see that the kind of like that I guess the bottom line from this to take is that you don't need to use a bunch of fancy or high level language to be using language well. You can use a bunch of short, kind of simple words, and we see that there's a repetition, and as well as like with the we shall fight, and then there's an change of the repetition with the last clause, we shall never surrender. So we see that Churchill is using words in a virtuosic way, but he's not necessarily using, a bunch of like 5 syllable, 3 syllable fancy words. He's using everyday language, but he's using it in a way that is deft and skillful. So the book also makes a distinction between using words that are right and wrong. And this is important. You want to make sure her general advice is to use those that are concrete, short, and properly spelled. And I think this is a good opportunity to just touch on like the fact that correct spelling and formatting are really basic requirements on most jobs. In the book, it mentions a dictionary, but of course, we know now that most of us use Google search. However, the massive availability of vocabulary and information on the internet does not ensure that people are always using vocabulary and language correctly. So really, like making sure that you choose the right word and that you don't use it in the wrong way is an important thing when you're writing for business, because you definitely want to ensure that the reader is can attest to your capabilities, to your intellect, right? Which you're showing them through the use of language. So I just a note to be aware of how the presentation of your paper is noticeable to others who read it. It's kind of like your professional signature. And, you know, so that's something to keep in mind, keeping in mind that everything is spelled correctly, that the spacing is good, that the formatting is strong, and it appears professional. And be aware of how to use a word before you try to use it. If you're not sure if it's right, double check. Because using words wrong is definitely not the professional signature that you are after. So in terms of words that are commonly used wrong, they give an example of the word affect with an E versus affect as an A. So we'll just go through the 3 ways to use it because this is a very common problem. And another thing that's useful if you find that you are struggling with the usage of this word to use affect versus affect correctly, impact is a good substitute. It works and you won't have to worry about it. But it is also good to learn. So we'll look at use of affect as a noun. Like your pen and stationery, the notebooks of letter can be amongst your most valuable effects. So that's effects there as a noun. We see it as a verb next. To effect a change for the better, leave the margins on your page. And then we see affect as a verb. So a crowded page will usually affect the letter's readability adversely. Okay? So, and you'll notice that how also when during these 3 excerpts, the author is also referencing formatting and highlighting the aesthetic component to business writing, and she's advising us to keep more whiteness on the page because it will make it easier for your reader to read. In terms of thinking about clarity and thinking about your reader on the other end of the tunnel, you definitely want to make it as easy for them to understand as possible. So, few or many. So this idea of using as little words as possible. Say as much as you can in as little words as possible. I think it's a testament to your ability as a writer. I think it's also a just a, yeah, it's important professionally as time is of the essence. Writing for a position is something that hopefully you will practice. I mean, I know you'll practice during this class because a lot of the assignments are very kind of short in terms of their word length, but actually what you realize is it takes quite a bit of time to craft something that's short because you want it to contain as much information as possible. And as far as writing for concision, for me, the way I've learned it is through trial and error, through drafting, through experimenting. And as I learn more as a writer, as the years go on, I get better at saying as much as I can with as little as possible. So the chapter also mentions apt or trite. So avoiding familiar, stereotypical phrases that clog sentences without adding to meaning or purpose. The trite phrases betray the writer's lack of individuality. And I think this is a reminder in professional writing. You kind of want to give a sense, sometimes but not always, of your personality, right? Through your kind of individual flair as a writer, through language. And that doesn't necessarily mean using a bunch of weird words or weird phrases, but kind of avoiding those phrases that are going to clog your sentences, are going to keep you from writing concisely, and really just don't mean anything because we hear them so much. It's kind of dead language, so to speak. The author also talks about whether or not you want to use objective versus subjective language. And I think this is kind of an interesting distinction, and it's almost a hard one to make sometimes, but it's just a way for you to kind of think about these things in your mind as you're choosing words and thinking about your intended audience and your purpose. So she makes the distinction between arrived at versus hammering out. And arrived at would be the objective po choice, and hammering out would be the subjective. And we see that arrived at is more of a kind of basic, unarguable way to describe something, as opposed to hammering out. It seems a little bit more opinionated, right? That's more of a subjective or personal way of expressing something. And she asks in the book, do you want to convey fact, feeling, or both? Is your purpose to inform or persuade? These questions inform what word you want to use. So again, just the idea of thinking about your audience as you're writing, and thinking about that down to nitpicking every last word that you choose, because every little piece ultimately serves and is pointing to a larger unit of meaning in terms of the reader's mind. I think a lot of the time you want to try to be objective, but there might be some circumstances where you feel like you need to persuade, and you might want to slide into that more subjective mode. Of course, ultimately, the goal of business writing is really to increase profit, right? So, of course, there are going to be times when you want to relay a certain sense, more of an emotional sense or a persuasive sense of something to your reader. And it really is a matter of thinking about what's your purpose and how does that word fit towards that purpose. So the author, as the last kind of way in which you want to think about words when you use them, and think about how they're working for your intended audience. So she makes a distinction between general or special vocabulary. So kind of specialized word versus ordinary vocabulary. So, based on your professional expertise or your niche, you might have a kind of vocabulary what's referred to as like jargon, which only people of of a certain status or expertise are familiar with. Now, you might think that using this jargon might show your reader how much you know, but I can say I think actually that works to the opposite effect. So the more technical the term, the fewer will comprehend, and the use of fancy terminology to make your readers slip isn't really an ideal goal for writing for business, right? What's typically better, and of course this again pertains to who you're communicating with, you want to use a general vocabulary that everyone can understand. An example of that is how this is actually my example. So bartenders typically refer to their kind of house vodkas, or like I'm just talking about like any type of alcohol really, kind of their cheapest, lowest priced drinks or types of liquor, they refer to as their wells. So that's their well drink. So typically a well drink would be, um, you know, that's something with that like vodka and Coke, for instance. But a customer who's coming to the restaurant isn't going to, when the bartender asks if they want a well drink, they aren't going to understand, right? So there's going to be, it's really going to slip them up, as opposed to if the bartender just said a drink made with low end vodka, they will immediately understand and be able to express their preference. And it's just a faster time frame. So again, at the right time, if the right person comes to the bar, perhaps someone who also works as a bartender, it might be inappropriate to call it a well drink. And by doing that, you save time because you don't really have to explain. So, well drink is a lot shorter of a phrase than a drink made with low end vodka. However, if used to the wrong audience, it goes to not a good purpose, not a good effect that's achieved with that. So, hopefully, this way of thinking about words that you use is useful for you all as you craft your cover letters for this week and you think about writing towards your audience and you think about how you might want to use diction or word choice as you craft a language towards your intended audience. All right, thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful.